The 3rd century is also the period of Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. And an interesting feature of late ancient philosophy is that although we think of late ancient philosophy as being extremely Platonic and dominated by this new tradition of Neoplatonism, they actually spend most of their time, it would seem, reading and arguing about Aristotle. One reason that they're doing that is their teaching curriculum, which will be important for us in what follows. They essentially think that the way you should teach someone philosophy is you should sit them down, teach them Aristotle for a few years. That's almost like giving them an undergraduate degree. And then if they go on to graduate work, then they can study Plato. So Aristotle is sort of philosophy for introductory level philosophy, and Plato is advanced philosophy. This is in part just because they thought the topics covered by Aristotle were more introductory, so logic, as we'll be seeing, but also Aristotle has much more to say about the physical world. So they thought it would be appropriate for you to study physics with the Aristotelian text and then move on to theology, which is what they thought most of the, or at least some of the more important Platonic dialogues were about. So the result of that is that although Alexander was really a dyed-in-the-wool Aristotelian peripatetic, most of the commentaries from late antiquity are actually by Platonists, and they were written for teaching purposes. So they're the equivalent of, say, logic textbooks or philosophy textbooks. And just as the sort of surviving outputs of these ancient commentators consist mostly of commentaries on Aristotle, because Aristotle is first, so you need more stuff to teach it. So most of their commentaries on Aristotle, or at least a disproportionate amount of them, are about logic. So for example, we have much more in the way of commentaries on the categories and the rest of the organon than we do on, say, the metaphysics or the ethics. In fact, we don't have any commentary on the ethics after Aspasius, who's an early commentator around the time of Alexander. So their whole perception of what's worth reading and what order you should read it in, both of philosophy in general and Aristotle in particular, is rather different from ours. So then moving forward, oh, sorry, I should mention that some of the people I'm going to be mentioning come from this school of commentators who were in Alexandria in Egypt, so around the 5th, 6th century, that was led by a man named Ammonius. And something that's noteworthy about that school is that they seem to have worked out a kind of accommodation with the Christians. There's a lot to say about this, but to make a long story short, it looks like Ammonius probably agreed not to put forward any teachings that were actively hostile to Christianity. And in return for that, they didn't chase him out of town, which is what they did to the Platonists in Athens. And in fact, Ammonius was so Christian-friendly that he was friendly with real-life Christians and had Christian students, among whom are two people called David and Elias, who are commentators of the Alexandrian school. So I think those are the 4 commentators I'm going to be mentioning: Ammonius, Elias, David, and Alexander, who's earlier. But they're all defending what they take to be Aristotle's position about the nature of logic. So then moving forward to the Arabic tradition, Arabic philosophy in the Islamic world, basically gets going in the 9th century when, for complicated reasons that I won't go into now, they translate Aristotle and other works of Greek science and philosophy into Arabic. And an interesting feature of this translation movement is that it seems to have been very strongly influenced by the late ancient conception of philosophy. So they, for one thing, translate all of Aristotle and none of Plato. They do have some kind of paraphrase summary versions of Plato, but there isn't a single, as far as we know, there wasn't a single dialogue by Plato that was actually translated in dialogue form in Arabic. Whereas there's nothing by Aristotle they didn't translate. And one reason for that might be that they looked at this huge corpus of philosophy from late antiquity, which ironically was by a bunch of Platonists, right? And they thought, oh, well, clearly what we should be doing is studying Aristotle, because that's what they did. So Aristotle comes to be more or less synonymous with Greek philosophy. except that they do also translate some original works by Neoplatonists, but I won't get into that. And the other thing about the Arabic translation movement is that they don't translate any Hellenistic philosophy. So actually, if you think about Hellenistic philosophy, none of the sources that we use, or almost none of the sources that we use to get access to the early Stoics and Epicurus and so on, none of these were translated into Arabic. So Diogenes Laertius wasn't translated into Arabic. Cicero, obviously, wasn't translated into Arabic because there was no Latin-Arabic translation movement, and so on. So they basically don't know anything about the Stoics and Epicureans and skeptics, except when they read passages in these Greek commentators on Aristotle, where the commentators are criticizing the Stoics. So, I mean, there is an expression in Arabic, which is like the people of the porch, which means the Stoics. But they really don't have any independent access to works by Stoics. So naturally enough, they're going to be repeating and defending the Aristotelian position on philosophy. The Arabic philosophers I'm going to be mentioning are Al-Kindi, aforementioned, who I've done a lot of work on. And he's the first Arabic philosopher, the first philosopher to write in Arabic. He's 9th century, he died around 870 or a little after that. And you can think about him as a kind of, I always say that he's a sort of public relations man for Greek philosophy. So he's trying to convince everyone that this Greek philosophy and science stuff is really great. And he loves all of it, and he thinks all of it agrees with the rest of it. So he's really interested in mathematics, he's interested in Euclid and Ptolemy and astrology and astronomy, and woo! He's really excited about Greek philosophy, including Aristotle and the Neoplatonists. So I'll be mentioning him briefly, but then the people we're mostly going to be talking about are a couple of generations later in the 10th century. And here the most famous figure is Al-Farabi. Have you all heard of Al-Farabi? I don't want to admit that you haven't. Okay. So, oh good, you did. Excellent. So Al-Farabi is the most famous member of this school. He's also distinctive as being really the only significant member of the group who was a Muslim. The rest of them were actually Christians. And it turns out that a distinctive feature of early Arabic philosophy is the involvement of Christians. Christians were often the translators who translate from Greek into Arabic, and sometimes the translators are also philosophers in their own right. So that's true of a couple of people I'm going to be mentioning. One is named Abu Bishr Mata, whose name is towards the top of the second page of the handout. And another is Yahya ibn Adi, who's also mentioned on the second page. These were both translators and philosophers in their own right. Other members of the school who I'll be mentioning come along in their train. And interestingly, these philosophers seem to have been looking back to the school of Alexandria, the Ammonius school, and thinking, oh, that's how you do philosophy. What you do is you sit around reading Aristotle, writing commentaries on him. And so they recreated this in Baghdad in the 10th century. So they would, I mean, we don't really have very much in the way of details about how they actually proceeded, but we do have, for example, a commentary on the physics where there's literally an Arabic translation of the physics in pieces, and then a translation of Greek commentaries on that passage, and then comments by the Arabic philosophers who are living in Baghdad as if, you know, it was just last week that they were reading Aristotle in Alexandria. It's really fascinating. Okay, so that's our cast of characters. Does anyone have any questions about that?